day. I'm Pat Halpin from the Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab at Duke University, and I'm going to be speaking about the approaches for spatial planning and specifically area-based management tools that were considered for the Northern Mid-Atlantic Ridge meeting in Évora, Portugal. Both area-based management tools and non-area-based management tool approaches can be applied together. And so the recent reports from the technical report from the Shenzhen meeting in Poland mentioned this. And I think it's a good place to start when we think about the interplay between area-based management as well as other kinds of management measures. So to provide a little bit of that context, the way I look at it is that there's cumulative impact assessments, area-based management tool development, and adaptive management processes that are all somewhat interconnected. The cumulative impacts assessment uses models of pressures, impacts, and risk. Area-based management identifies areas, sites, vulnerable marine ecosystems. And the adaptive management looks at measures and management approaches. These are all complementary approaches. And so we're going to focus in on how and why they fit together. And the area-based management tools really looks at a priori mapping of with opportunistic or periodic updates, potentially in the future, and also thinking about the delivering maps of specific areas, vulnerable marine ecosystems, areas of precaution, so a variety of different kinds of tools and approaches. When I said these were complementary, they also operate at different potential scales, where the cumulative impacts assessment tends to look at much more of a bioregional scale. Area-based management tends to look specifically at the specified scope or extent of the planning region. And adaptive management is going to be much more closely tied to exploration or extraction areas. These are all nested and complementary approaches. So focusing in on the area-based management tools, we need to consider how area-based management tools may need to differ between different kinds of seafloor regions. So areas of polymetallic crusts differ from areas of polymetallic nodules, which differ from polymetallic sulfide regions. The physical shapes, the environments, the structure of these features are very different. And so we feel that it's important to be able to use different tools in different regions and use more appropriate tools to the different cases. So just a little background, the first environmental management plan was the CCZ plan in the Pacific. And this one used a very broad approach that looked at biophysical gradients, tried to look at capturing ranges of habitat types, tried to implement large areas to be able to look at protecting minimum viable population sizes, looked at including buffer zones to ensure that the areas that were set aside were protected from mining impacts, and also used simple shapes and simple straight lines as a way to make it easier to facilitate rapid recognition and compliance. So at the end of the day, the CCZ example created 9 rectangular APIs with 200 kilometer by 200 kilometer areas with an additional 100 kilometer buffer around them, extending those areas out to 400 kilometer squares. This simple design reflects both the desire to have a parsimonious criteria, but also reflected the limits of spatial precision and knowledge about data and information in this region. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is a pretty different region from the abyssal plains of the Pacific. And so we think that it could be useful, and at the Évora meeting, we thought it was useful to bring forward some potentially different tools as a way to try to target the spatial tools that are being used to the configuration of the region. So the Northern Mid-Atlantic Ridge is more spatially complex and linear feature than the CCZ. Observation data and expert knowledge does exist for some specific habitat sites in the Northern Mid-Atlantic Ridge. It was also thought that targeting known sites first, then later potentially moving to representation approaches may be a more appropriate area-based management tool strategy in the northern mid-Atlantic ridge versus the CCZ. And finally, a more flexible portfolio of both fine scale and broad scale tools can be useful in this region. So using somewhat different approaches that could be better targeted to the complexity and the type of terrain and the type of features that are encountered in the northern mid-Atlantic ridge. So there were three general area-based management tool approaches that were discussed in EVERA. The first were observations of vulnerable species or ecosystem occurrences. The second were descriptions of specific important sites or areas. And then the third, what was discussed, was the selection of representative ecosystem features and gradients. This third category was discussed but not implemented during the EVERA workshop, so that's why I have that in gray. The first two were discussed more fully and were mapped. In addition to those three approaches, there were two different categories that were created to look at the available knowledge and potential recommended action. One was to have sites or areas that were intended to be set aside for protection. These were areas where there was sufficient information to justify describing the qualities and vulnerability of these areas and the ecological importance. Another category was put in to have sites or areas in need of precaution, and this was generally ascribed to areas where the data may not have been sufficient to fully describe areas and features with precision or knowledge. And so these were areas that might have these features. And so this idea of having areas of precaution was a way to have a more proactive category to look at the precautionary principle. So this matrix here is trying to just describe the different kinds of tools that were implemented at the EVERA meeting. The first were observation of vulnerable species and ecosystems. And when those areas were described in full, they were put into a category titled Sites in Need of Protection. When they were inferred or predicted, features or ecosystems, they were put into a category called Sites in Need of Precaution. They were implemented through the use of a VME criteria specifically applied in the context of the ISA. The second group were descriptions of specific important areas. These were areas in need of protection, but also could be areas in need of precaution. And these would be using or were implemented using important area criteria and templates. The third type, which would be more what we think of as representative areas, these were not considered fully. They were discussed, but not considered and not mapped during the EVERA workshop. So this combined approach ended up with three different categories of area-based management features that were described: sites in need of precaution, sites in need of protection, and areas in need of protection were mapped from the outcomes of the EVERA meeting. The three different criteria I already mentioned were taken from well-known and existing criteria. So the VME criteria modified and used from the FAO were used to describe vulnerable marine ecosystems. So for example, active hydrothermal vent communities were considered to be vulnerable. Import area criteria were used after the criteria developed for the EBSA process from the CBD, and these were used to describe specific features such as specific fracture zone areas or other areas that were described as potentially regionally important. The representative network criteria that was discussed was looking at representativity, connectivity, replication, and adequacy, which are more network level criteria. The implementation of both the VME type of criteria and the important area criteria were collected using templates to allow a uniform application of each of these for every site described. So the sites in need of protection were fine-scale sites based on the occurrence of vulnerable or sensitive species using an FAO type of VME criteria adapted for the ISA application. In this case, 11 active hydrothermal vent sites were described in detail. And so these were known active vent sites described, and a template was collected for each of these 11 different sites. Areas in need of protection were also described, and these were larger scale areas looking at representative or self-sustaining ecosystems, and they were areas that were described because of unique values or importance. In this context, 3 different areas of selected fracture zones were described and written up using templates, important area template criteria. These were the Kane, Vima, and Romanche fracture zone areas. For sites in need of precaution, they're either fine-scale individual sites or larger areas that have been predicted to exist or are believed to potentially exist in areas. And so these were areas where there was not observation data to support them, but there were areas where caution should be applied. So one example of this were 12 inferred active hydrothermal vent areas that were inferred but not defined and not observed. And so these areas were mapped as areas of potential precaution for future application. And also areas that were believed to be suitable for cold water octocorals were also mapped as areas of potential precaution. So in summary, the outcome of the area-based management tool exercise in EVERA identified 11 sites in need of protection, 3 areas in need of protection, 12 sites in need of precaution, and also a suitability model of areas in need of precaution for cold water octocoral suitability. So those were the 4 different primary area-based management tool outcomes from the EVERA workshop. So I think we will just wrap up the discussion at this point, and hopefully this will help set the stage for our further discussions during this meeting. Thank you.